Okay, well, welcome to today's Access Chat. We're very excited to be talking to two guests from Toronto, Canada. They are with Usability Matters, and we have Lene Vizard, and we also have Heather Moore coming to us from Toronto. And so, Heather, why don't you start, introduce yourself, and then we'll pass it to Lene and let her introduce herself. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the organization and how you got into this field.
Sure. I'm a visual designer at Usability Matters. I got started into this field actually through the print industry. I worked in the print industry, and I worked with the Alzheimer's Society, actually, which was my first view into accessible design. Back then, I didn't know that it was called accessible design necessarily. And the print industry is kind of dwindling a little bit, so I was back and forth between jobs and realized there was something called user experience design and got into that and found my passion. And that naturally just led to accessible design in the digital realm. So at Usability Matters, we focus on usability, obviously, and strategy and research as well.
Mm-hmm. And my story is sort of similar. I have a background in industrial design. And when I graduated, I transitioned into digital. There was a lot of jobs, and kind of taking that human and people-centered design practice means, of course, you need to design in an accessible and inclusive way. And then through my work at Usability Matters and working with awesome colleagues like Heather, we've really grown our accessibility practice and expertise, particularly in the digital realm and with the overlap with user experience.
And when you're talking about usability, you really are talking about the customer experience and accessibility. So do you all mind elaborating a little bit on that?
Sure. Lynn, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, for sure. So, of course, user experience design is about making great, usable experiences for people. So oftentimes for us, it has a digital focus, and that includes things like websites, apps, software. And we also think about, the more holistic or entire experience, not necessarily just a digital touch point or channel. And what we're really trying to do is make sure that the experiences people have with a product or service are easy to use and enjoyable, and then building on that, that they're available and inclusive to the broadest range of people possible. And so one of the really awesome things is that, good user experience design should be accessible by nature. The two really feed into each other and overlap, and if you have an accessible experience, it's going to make a better experience for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. There's so much overlap between user experience design and accessible design that they really should just be under the same umbrella as user experience design.
Yeah, we definitely agree with that. And how are are the Canadian laws, are they impacting the work that you are doing? Are you, are you blending that into what you're doing? Tell us more about that. We've had on other Canadian guests, and we're very fascinated about what you're doing and, how you're making sure this is embedded in everything that, all the ICT, all the built environments in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Right. So in Ontario, we have the AODA, which is an accessibility law in Ontario. And specifically for web, it follows the WCAG guidelines. And there's different timelines based on what you need to meet. We tend to steer towards the AA guidelines, although people don't necessarily need to meet it yet. But why not, right? It just makes for a better experience overall. When we test with users, though, we don't test based on guidelines, we test for user experience, because we've seen in the past there's so many sites that follow the WCAG guidelines strictly but still provide a really terrible user experience for everyone.
Do you mind elaborating on how you're testing for user experience? The reason why I ask is because that really seems to be very broad. So
It
talk
is.
about how you're doing it, and I agree. Sometimes when we're just focused on compliance, we're very focused on compliance in the United States. Sometimes when you're just focused on the compliance, you don't have sometimes it's not as usable and as accessible as we really hope that it would be.
Mhm. Yeah. So the WCAG guidelines are a good start, but they're certainly not an end. And when we test for user experience, we typically set out some tasks that we want the user to complete, and then just let them go on the site and try and complete it. So it's pretty much the same as usability testing, just with people who might have impairments or are using assistive technology. It's can they complete the task, and are they comfortable completing the task?
So you are using individuals with disabilities that know assistive technology, that use assistive technology. Give us some examples of the types of disabilities and assistive technology that you're using for these customer experiences.
Right, so we've tested with people who are blind and use a screen reader. We've also tested with people with various cognitive impairments that use quite a range of different assistive technology, including style sheets even. We've tested with people who have low vision and are zooming in 8 times on a website. We've done a little bit of almost everything, I'd say.
Lene, did you want to comment on any of this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Heather's covered lots of the salient points. I will say one thing that's quite exciting for us is that legislation like the AODA, while compliance shouldn't be the kind of pure focus, it has provided a great door opener, and we are seeing increased demand for designing accessibly, testing for accessibility, and I'm excited because I think it's opening that door.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Antonio.
In the current work that you are doing, in what areas, in what industries are you able to observe more growth and more interest in making a good experience for the users, considering the different audiences that type of business might have?
Yeah, for sure. One of the ones we're seeing a lot of is travel. So a lot of our travel clients are, they have multiple legislations, so the DOTA as well as AODA or Canadian legislation, and so that's one industry where we're seeing a lot of interest.
Yeah, we're starting to see a bit more banking as well come up into our clients.
I will say that I have written a book that it took me forever, but it's publishing in a couple of weeks, and it's called Uncovering Hidden Human Capital. And one of the best practices that I've seen all over the world has been TD Bank, right there coming. I mean, I know it's bigger, it's more than a Canadian bank, but it is a Canadian bank and has presence in many countries, but we've seen some really, really good best practices coming from that bank, as well as some of your other banks as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been quite a leap in the past little bit between them being completely inaccessible to now being pretty good, and we can rely on them and point to them as a good example.
In terms of mobile development, from the experience that you will have, you see someone, okay, we put together this app, now we need your help. Can you just help us? We just have this, and now we need to find a way to make this accessible. Do you see this happening, or you do see someone, okay, we're going to create an app, we need to start writing accessible code from the first lines? What do you see happening here?
So I think, and Heather can weigh in as well, but I think, in recent times what we've really seen is, unfortunately, more of that sort of somewhat afterthought or coming with something that's been developed and saying, hey, we realize we actually need to take accessibility into consideration. We may have legislation that we need to comply with. Can you help us? So oftentimes we are sort of going in and auditing or testing an existing product. But what happens from there is that, again, that sort of opens the door to building in accessibility because people and clients realize that actually if we had maybe thought about this a little bit earlier on in our development cycles, we wouldn't sort of be in the place we are now. And so often then what happens is we engage with them to help build in accessibility design principles and approaches, and looking at how to get their development teams up to speed. So there's sort of been increased coaching as well around how do we build this in at an earlier point. I'm not sure if Heather wants to add a little bit.
No, I think you covered everything exactly. We do spend a lot of time auditing projects that our clients come to us with, and it'd be nice if it was thought about earlier. And if it was thought about earlier, then there's no need to just tack on some accessibility feature later on, which ends up not really being accessible.
Right, right. The one thing that we're seeing, it hasn't happened, but there's threats of it happening in the United States. We're seeing a lot of litigation, a lot of lawsuits in the United States over inaccessible web, just a tremendous amount. But now I've actually had a few lawyers reach out to me and say that next they're going to be going after the mobile apps, they're going to be going after the privacy statements, things like proxies, and so the documents, the PDFs, that we haven't seen a lot of litigation. And whether or not, once again, we do things right in the United States, it's just the way we do it. We create legislation and then we sue each other to pound it out. So it's just the way we do it. I can't always explain it, but I do think it's fascinating. And I was talking to a customer the other day, and they were saying, well, what do you mean making the mobile app accessible? Are you talking about all of our apps? Are you talking about our partners' apps? And I said, well, are your partners' mobile apps on your website and your customers are using them? Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. You have it out there and they're part of your customer offering. Yes. So it sounds like you are doing a lot of work with that as well.
No,
Oh, sorry. It's just interesting that you say that, because we've run into situations where our client is using a third-party tool which isn't accessible, and they just think, oh, we don't have to worry about that because we didn't make it. But actually, you kind of do need to worry about that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Antonio.
No, it's interesting that we have last week we have a guest that also works in this area in Norway, where they have a completely different approach. And they almost avoid litigation, and they do a lot of work educating business, trying to make sure that they actually adhere and use accessibility and build accessibility tools. So there are two main approaches in this area, considering the geographies. And in fact, in the conversation that we had with Malin last week, she was saying, no, I'm from the authority that regulates universal design in Norway, but I never had to find anyone. So we're trying to educate and make sure that everybody's is in our side.
Mm-hmm. And we're the opposite. We're the opposite in the U.S. Everybody has to be found. Sorry. Lynn, do you want to comment on that, or Heather, you want to come a little bit more on that? Not the U.S. part, the part that Antonio was saying.
Yeah, I mean, I watched that chat actually with great interest, and it is fascinating, just the mindset. And I mean, kind of what I took from the chat with Malin was that it's kind of just a mindset that it's the right thing to do, that you're honoring kind of people's, human rights and dignity, and you're kind of coming from that angle, and that it doesn't quite have the same, that sort of let's find people and let's kind of have this iron rule, but that we're all kind of doing this collectively for a greater good in a way. And again, I would kind of go back to the point that, well, in Canada, I think the legislation is sort of opening doors and driving some of that. I'm excited because I think it's a good starting point, like Heather said. And it's building awareness,
Yeah, it is. It is a good starting point. It still kind of blows my mind that we still have to explain to people that this is the right thing to do. Like, you shouldn't just follow a law and do it just because of that. It is the right thing to do, and it creates a better experience for everyone in the end.
Right. And I think that's the most important point that we keep making over and over on Access Chat. When you make something accessible and usable for people with disabilities, we all benefit from it.
Yeah, everybody 100%. Yeah, Heather and I were, chatting a bit in preparation for this, and I said that one of the things that I really kind of want is, you know, the definitive guide to accessibility for a user experience practitioner, because oftentimes a lot of it comes down to, you know, visual design or coding implementation. However, we sort of talked about how ultimately if you're doing good user experience design, if you're chunking out content, using good hierarchies, you know, having logical flows, it inherently should be accessible anyway. Like the two are just really interchangeable, and the principles and approaches are really the same.
Agreed. Agreed. You know, I forgot to mention before, and I'm going to just mention it real quick. Neil Milken wasn't able to join us today because he's on holiday and he is operating big, heavy machinery, which sounds scary to Antonio and I. So I know he would have loved this conversation. So, you know, he would have added a lot to it. Antonio, do you want to make a comment?
No. Sometimes when we do online activities, one of the things that we realize is we are always asking for, trying to have the attention from someone. You know, if it's a brand trying to get attention from consumers to their site, it's all about attention. And when people provide attention to us, you know, could be attending a Twitter chat, could be browsing in your website. The marketing efforts, they start from the moment that you have a tool and you are able to provide something that is accessible and everybody can consume. And if you create something that is easily consumable, people tend to spend more time in your site than if you just have something that overloads your senses. So we talked this a few times, is your marketing efforts also start in the way how you address the way our users experience everything that you design.
Yeah, 100%. It reminds me of something I was reading recently around plain language, and that it's been shown through some research that the people who most enjoy and want plain language are actually the readers with the highest literacy levels, because they're often the people who have the most to read and really are thankful for you know, things being simplified, being plain language, being chunked out, being able to kind of work through things quickly. So, you know, it's sort of a fallacy to say that, oh, we're dumbing this down, or, you know, this isn't good. It's a perfect example of we're competing for people's attention. Making it simple and short and usable is great for everyone, even those with, say, the highest literacy levels, or even sort of maybe the group you're not necessarily targeting, right? But you're competing for attention, and making it easy is going to help everyone.
Wow, that is fascinating. No one has ever really approached it from that perspective. That is really a good point. We would love to see that article if you have it.
Sure, yeah. We can send it along, yeah.
Yeah. Heather, do you want to comment?
Yeah, and I think that's a prime example of where WCAG falls short, because they don't really include anything about language, because it's kind of hard to create a guideline around that, but it's such an important aspect to accessible design.
You know, one thing that, you know, thank goodness we have the WCAG, and I know I've been part of the WCAG, the cognitive group, and it's so important that we have global standards. Mm-hmm. But that's exactly what they are. They're standards. There's a very important place for them, but then you take the standards and you make it, you know, more usable for the human beings that are doing it. So you enhance, you know, the customer experience. And so I think it all goes hand in hand. You have to have the baseline standards that we all know what to comply with. And once again, if maybe that's not always the right word, but, you know, sometimes tell me the baseline of where I'm going, and then I'll build upon it. But then making sure that is accessible to individuals, I think, is very powerful. A question that I have is, I know we've talked about you're doing a lot of work with web and mobile, but tell us more. Are you working on built-in barrier, the built environment, but are you also doing more when it comes to ICT as well? You know, the PDFs, and I mean, it's such a broad term, ICT, Internet Communications and Technology, but tell us more about your work. Is it just I shouldn't say just technology because that's so big, but is it also going into the built environment like some of the previous guests we had as well?
Yeah, so we focus mostly on the digital realm, and that includes PDFs often and other digital formats. Lynn does a lot of work with service design, actually, so can probably speak to more on that side of things.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, predominantly at our sort of practice, we are looking, as Heather said, at digital as the kind of primary focus. But more and more we're seeing a demand for kind of looking at the other pieces of an experience, which would include things like the built environment. So we're excited to start getting our hands on a bit more of that type of thing. But for now, you know, the predominant sort of project work has been around these digital touch points, including things like PDFs for sure. And to kind of go back to a bit of an earlier point that you were making, this idea that, you know, the guidelines are a good starting point, and then you want to make sure it is accessible to actual human beings, is precisely the reason why we have a strong emphasis on doing testing with actual users. So, you know, if you go ahead and audit and do your code checks and your visual inspections and all these things, and you kind of feel like, yes, I've checked the boxes and it's WCAG compliant, that really means nothing if you haven't sat down with someone who's using an assistive technology or who may have an impairment and said, hey, can you actually do what you need to do here? Can you log in and check your, you know, your bank balance? Can you book that plane ticket? And that's why we really have this emphasis on testing with real users and a whole range of users, right? So, you know, an approach that we sometimes like to do is if we're doing some usability testing, you could include per sample, you know, we usually do about 8 people. You could include someone in that group who's using an assistive technology or who has some kind of impairment. So kind of always finding ways to put these things in front of, you know, quote unquote real people on a wide range. Yeah.
Right, Lene, I have a question. One thing that I had built a company years ago called Tech Access, and we did a lot of customer testing and user testing, and one thing I found that a lot of my testers who themselves were blind, for example, and used screen readers and things, a lot of them were masters of their assistive technology. I remember one guy we called Mr. Jaws because he was so good at the Jaws screen reader. But we found that many of the users, the customers, they're not power users of assistive technology. So we actually started going in and using people that had, you know, become blind or were new or they had just started using assistive technology. So we would actually use people that were new to their assistive technology or intermediate, and as well as the power users. We found the power users could work around things that the new users couldn't. I was just wondering if y'all if you've done any of that.
For sure, and you make a really good point. When you're recruiting or thinking about who you might want to test with for this particular round, thinking about their experience level with the technology. And one of the things that sort of surprised me when we started out was seeing how, you know, versioning is definitely a factor for people. You may have older technology, or you may simply just have a version that you're comfortable with and you don't want to upgrade. So we really saw this kind of range of setups in terms of the technology, the versioning, and for sure thinking about the experience level and that kind of power user. It's amazing the things that people will work around that they kind of shouldn't have to. So we do try to think a bit about the experience level as we recruit, and maybe Heather can speak a bit more to kind of that and how we consider it.
Yeah, absolutely. Range. We have seen in the past, to your point, Deborah, that there are often people who are so good at using their technology that they can get around errors to the point where we don't even notice that it's an error or an issue. So keeping that in mind, that's also the importance of doing in-person usability testing versus remote, as you can be by the side of the person and talk them through any issues that they're having and things like that.
I have found that some of the most powerful learning experience for corporations is actually seeing people with disabilities of different abilities with their assistive technology, like we're talking about, using their technology, working on their websites. It is such a powerful experience. I did it with a very large telecommunications company in the United States, and they were shocked at how, excuse me, a person that was using a magnification program and a screen reader how they were using their products and services. It was such a powerful learning experience for them, and they were able to ask questions and say, okay, well, I saw that you used it this way, and you're using the links this way. We thought you were going to use them this other way, and it was, I think it's so powerful. I don't think anything's more powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Building empathy is really important to us, and quite often we'll do that. We'll either demo a screen reader or zooming in ourselves, or we'll show some videos or have someone else demo it, but also getting those people hands-on themselves. So getting them to try and navigate their own website with a keyboard and realizing how frustrating it is when they can't. Getting them to learn a bit of how to use a screen reader and turning their monitor off and trying to navigate that way, and realizing just how frustrating websites are.
I'll say one more point. And if anybody that has watched Access Chat regularly know this is a hot topic for me, but employment. The thing that should happen with all of the efforts that we're making all over the world to make sure we all can use technology, we all can use our buildings, our services, our products, people with disabilities should be getting meaningful employment out of this. You know, I mean, who better to tell you if a website is accessible to a person that's blind than a person that's blind? And so I'd really like to see us making a lot more employment, having a lot better employment outcomes for people with disabilities, because they add such great value to these conversations. So it's exciting to watch your group make sure that these individuals are being included in the work that you're doing.
Mm-hmm. It's crucial, and it's also crucial, in any type of testing or, participatory design, that people are compensated for their time and for the lived experience and the sort of expertise in the room that they're bringing. So we always try to make sure that people are being compensated appropriately when they're coming in to help us, test something. And that sort of goes across the board for any type of, design research that you're doing. And I totally agree. It's a huge issue, right? How do we all create better employment opportunities for a wide range of people?
Today we have so many new technologies coming. We have 3D printing, virtual reality, Internet of Things. In those areas, is there anything that was able to catch your attention? How do you think that will, even change or add on something to your current professions?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We haven't seen anything yet, but I'm sure it's coming as technology advances all the time and people use it in different and interesting ways. And then I don't know if you've seen anything.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, in a way, there's still so much work to do on some of the things that exist now. But it will be fascinating to see what some of the opportunities are going to be and the different ways that people are going to kind of use technologies. And, to that point again, that these innovations help everyone. Like, the voice to type, for example, is something I know, like, my dad uses that frequently, or, all of these things are kind of feeding into each other and benefiting everyone. So it'll be exciting to see.
Okay, so we are closing down our interview for today. Thank you so much, Angela, Linnea, and Deborah, for being part of this. We look forward to meet you again tomorrow between 8 to 9 London time, and it will be interesting because we have an interesting group of people that regularly join the Twitter chat. They sometimes ask questions, so we have a very interesting community that is looking forward to be able to meet you tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.